The deer crossed my fence line at dawn, and I watched through my binoculars as Susan Patterson's face turned the color of an overripe tomato when she spotted them from her pristine back deck. I knew it was coming before she even grabbed her phone, and sure enough, within 20 minutes, I saw her marching down the road toward my property with 3 other HOA board members trailing behind her, like ducklings following their mother. I owned 800 acres of prime hunting land in rural Pennsylvania, just outside the town of Wellsboro. The property had been in my family for 3 generations, passed down from my grandfather to my father, and finally to me, Isaac Calloway, 5 years ago when Dad decided retirement in Florida sounded better than another Pennsylvania winter. The land was gorgeous, covered in dense hardwood forest, rolling hills, and 3 natural springs that fed into a creek running through the entire property. More importantly, it was a wildlife paradise. White-tailed deer, wild turkey, black bear, and every small game animal you could imagine called my land home. The problem started 2 years ago when Meadowbrook Estates, a cookie-cutter housing development, went up on the adjacent property. 50 identical houses, each painted in one of 3 approved colors, with perfectly manicured lawns and enough rules to make a military academy look lenient. The development sat on what used to be the old Morrison farm, which had been sold off after the family couldn't keep up with property taxes. I'd tried to buy it myself, but the developers outbid me by a substantial margin. At first, things were fine. The new neighbors kept to themselves, and I kept to mine. But then Susan Patterson got elected HOA president, and everything went straight to hell. "Mr. Calloway," Susan's shrill voice cut through the peaceful morning air as she approached my front porch. She was a woman in her early 50s, with short blonde hair, styled in that classic, "I want to speak to the manager" cut, and she wore expensive athleisure clothing despite never having set foot in a gym as far as I could tell. "Mr. Calloway, we need to talk about these deer." I set down my coffee mug and leaned against the porch railing. "Morning, Susan. Nice day, is not it?" "Do not try to be cute with me," she snapped, hands on her hips. Behind her, the other board members looked uncomfortable. I recognized Tom Hendricks, the vice president, and 2 women whose names I could never remember. "Those deer are destroying our landscaping. Last night, they ate 12 rose bushes from my garden alone. Do you have any idea how much those cost?" "I imagine quite a bit," I said calmly, "but I do not see how that is my problem." Susan's eyes narrowed. "They are coming from your property. You need to do something about them." "Like what exactly?" "Get rid of them. Shoot them. Trap them. I do not care. Just keep them off our property." I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting her stew for a moment. "Susan, those are wild animals. I do not own them. They go where they want. But they are living on your land. Sometimes they also live in the state game lands 5 miles north and probably on half a dozen other properties in the area. That is what wild animals do. They roam." Tom Hendricks stepped forward, clearly trying to be the voice of reason. "Isaac, maybe we could work something out. What if we paid you to, reduce the population a bit? Hunting season is coming up, right?" "Hunting season starts in November," I confirmed. "But here's the thing, Tom. I hold exclusive hunting rights to this entire 800 acres. That is part of the lease agreement I have with a local hunting club. They pay me $15,000 a year for exclusive access during hunting season. I do not hunt here myself anymore because of that agreement, and I sure as hell am not going to interfere with it." Susan's face somehow turned an even deeper shade of red. $15,000? You are making money off these pests while they destroy our property? "I'm making money off my legal right to lease my private property for lawful hunting activities," I corrected. "And white-tailed deer are not pests. They are a managed wildlife species regulated by the Pennsylvania Game Commission." "This is unacceptable," Susan practically screamed. "The HOA will not stand for this." I set my coffee down and crossed my arms. "Susan, with all due respect, the HOA has absolutely no authority over my property. I do not live in Meadowbrook Estates. I do not pay dues to your organization. You have zero say in what I do with my land as long as I am following state and federal law, which I am." "We will see about that," she hissed. "Come on, everyone. We are going to contact our lawyer." They marched off, and I watched them go with a sinking feeling in my gut. I had dealt with difficult neighbors before, But something about Susan's tone told me this was just the beginning. I was right. 2 weeks later, I received a certified letter from Schneider, Hoffman and Associates, a law firm out of Williamsport. The letter claimed that I was maintaining a wildlife nuisance on my property, and that the deer population constituted a public health hazard due to potential for vehicle collisions and Lyme disease transmission. It demanded that I take immediate action to reduce the deer population or face legal consequences. I took the letter to my own lawyer, Bill Hutchinson, who had handled my family's legal matters for 20 years. Bill read through it, chuckled, and tossed it on his desk. "This is garbage, Isaac," he said, leaning back in his chair. "They do not have a leg to stand on. You are not maintaining a nuisance. Deer are wild animals. You cannot be held liable for their natural behavior." So I just ignore it? I will write a response explaining why their claims are baseless, but yeah, essentially. They are fishing, probably hoping you will get scared and either pay them off or voluntarily start controlling the deer population. Not happening. Good. Because the moment you start taking responsibility for those deer, you are opening yourself up to actual liability. Right now, they are wild animals. Nobody owns them. Nobody controls them. That is your protection. Bill's response letter must have made Susan angry, because the next thing I knew, she was calling the Pennsylvania Game Commission, filing complaints about overpopulation and dangerous wildlife conditions. A game warden named Jeff Morrison, no relation to the family who used to own the land, showed up at my place on a Thursday afternoon. "Isaac Calloway?" he asked, extending his hand as he got out of his truck. "That is me. What can I do for you, officer?" "Got a few complaints about deer population on your property. Mind if I take a look around?" "Not at all. Want me to come with you?" "That would be great, actually." We spent 2 hours walking my property. Jeff was a good guy, probably in his late 30s, with the kind of easy competence that comes from years of working outdoors. He asked about my land management practices, my hunting lease, and the deer population. I answered everything honestly. "How many deer would you estimate are using this property?" he asked as we stood near one of the springs. "Hard to say exactly. I see different groups regularly. Maybe 60, 70 animals total, but they are not all here at once. They move around." Jeff nodded, making notes. "That is actually pretty normal for 800 acres of good habitat. I've seen much higher densities in agricultural areas." He looked up at me. "You know why I'm really here, right? HOA complaints?" "Yep. We've gotten about a dozen calls in the past week, all from residents of Meadowbrook Estates. They want us to declare your property an overpopulation zone and force you to allow special hunts." "Can you do that?" "Technically, yes, but only if there is actually an overpopulation problem. And from what I'm seeing, there is not. Your deer population is healthy and within normal parameters for this habitat type. The issue is not too many deer. The issue is people moved into deer habitat and are surprised there are deer." I laughed. "So what happens now?" "I will file my report saying there is no overpopulation issue. That should be the end of it from our perspective. But between you and me?" He lowered his voice, even though we were alone in the woods. "I would document everything, take photos, keep records, because these HOA types do not give up easily, and I have seen situations like this get ugly." He was right about that. Over the next month, Susan and her HOA board tried everything they could think of. They filed a complaint with the Township Zoning Board, claiming I was running a commercial hunting operation without proper permits. That got dismissed when I showed up with my lease agreement and my lawyer, proving that leasing land for hunting was explicitly allowed under agricultural use exemptions. They tried to get the township to pass an ordinance banning the feeding or harboring of deer. That failed when several other longtime residents showed up to the township meeting and pointed out that such an ordinance would be both unenforceable and potentially illegal under state law, which reserves wildlife management authority to the Game Commission. They even tried to claim that my property was not properly posted with no trespassing signs, suggesting that they had the right to come onto my land and take measures themselves. I responded by walking my entire property line and putting up new signs every 50 feet, which was well beyond the legal requirement. But the most audacious thing they tried happened on a Saturday morning in early October. I was in my workshop rebuilding the carburetor on my old tractor when I heard a gunshot echo across my property. Then another. Then 2 more in quick succession. I dropped what I was doing and ran for my truck, grabbing my phone to call 911 as I went. I knew exactly what was happening, and I was furious. I found them about a quarter mile into my property, near the old logging road that ran through the eastern section. There were 2 men I had never seen before, dressed in hunting gear, standing over a dead doe. They had a pickup truck parked on the road, and they were in the process of field dressing the deer. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" I shouted, jumping out of my truck. Both men looked up, startled. One of them, a heavy-set guy in his 40s with a patchy beard, stood up and wiped his hands on his pants. "We have permission to be here." "Like hell you do. This is private property, and I'm the owner. Who told you that you could hunt here?" "Lady from the HOA," the other man said. He was younger, maybe late 20s. "She said the deer were a nuisance and needed to be controlled. She is paying us $500 to take out as many as we can today." "Let me guess. Susan Patterson?" "Yeah, that is her name. Look, man, we are just trying to make some money. She said it was all legal." "It is not legal. It is trespassing, it is poaching, and depending on how you want to look at it, it might be theft of services since I have a paid hunting lease on this property. Stay right where you are. The police are on their way." The younger guy's eyes went wide. "Oh, shit. Dude, we did not know. She said she had the authority." "She does not have any authority over my property. She lives in the HOA next door." The heavy-set guy looked angry now. "That bitch. She told us this was HOA land and the deer were destructive. She showed us papers and everything." "What kind of papers?" "I do not know. Some official-looking documents. We did not read them that carefully. $500 is $500. A Pennsylvania State Police cruiser came bumping down the logging road 10 minutes later. The trooper, a tall woman named Officer Ramirez, took statements from everyone and examined the dead deer. The 2 hunters were cited for hunting without landowner permission and had their licenses confiscated, pending a hearing with the Game Commission. The deer was seized as evidence. "What about Susan Patterson?" I asked Officer Ramirez. "She is the one who sent them onto my property." "We will be having a conversation with her," Ramirez said grimly. "Depending on what she says, she could be looking at charges for conspiracy to commit trespassing and possibly filing a false report if she claims she had authority over this land." I followed Officer Ramirez to Susan's house in Meadowbrook Estates. By the time we arrived, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered, probably wondering why a state trooper was at the HOA president's door. Susan answered on the 3rd knock, and her face went white when she saw the officer. "Susan Patterson?" Officer Ramirez asked. "Yes?" "I need to talk to you about 2 men you hired to hunt on Isaac Calloway's property." "I do not know what you are talking about." "Madam, both men have given statements saying you hired them and told them they had permission to hunt on the property adjacent to this development." Susan's expression shifted from fear to defiance. "Those deer are a menace. Someone has to do something about them. Mr. Calloway refuses to be a responsible neighbor." "Mr. Calloway has no legal obligation to control wildlife on his private property," Officer Ramirez said. "By sending hunters onto his land without his permission, you facilitated an act of trespassing and illegal hunting. That is a crime, Mrs. Patterson." "I have rights as a homeowner? Those deer are destroying our property values?" "You have the right to protect your own property within legal bounds. You do not have the right to send people onto someone else's property. Did you tell those men they had legal authority to hunt on Mr. Calloway's land?" Susan hesitated, and I could see her trying to calculate her way out of this. "I may have implied that the HOA had an agreement." "Did you have an agreement?" "Not in writing, but so you lied to them." "I did not lie. I interpreted the situation based on our legal consultations." Officer Ramirez was not buying it. "Madam, I am going to need you to come down to the station and make a formal statement. Depending on what the district attorney decides, you may be charged with criminal trespass by proxy and conspiracy." The crowd of neighbors was murmuring now, and I could see several of them looking at Susan with expressions ranging from shock to anger. Tom Hendricks pushed through the crowd. "Officer, I am the vice president of the HOA board. I want to make it clear that Mrs. Patterson was acting on her own here. The board never authorized any kind of hunting operation, and we were not aware she was planning this." That's not true, Susan protested. We discussed it at the last meeting. We discussed the deer problem, Tom said firmly. We never discussed hiring hunters to go onto someone else's property. That was entirely your idea, and several of us objected when you brought it up. Susan looked betrayed. You're all turning on me? After everything I have done for this community? You went too far, Susan, one of the women from the crowd said. This is not what we signed up for. Officer Ramirez put a hand on Susan's shoulder. Mrs. Patterson, let us continue this at the station. You are not under arrest at this time, but I need a formal statement. As they walked to the cruiser, Susan shot me a look of pure hatred. I just stood there, arms crossed, watching her go. The next HOA meeting was 3 days later, and I decided to attend. Technically, as a non-resident, I had no standing, but Tom Hendricks had called me personally and invited me to come speak. He wanted to clear the air and make sure everyone understood the situation. The meeting was held in the community center, a small building near the entrance to Meadowbrook Estates. About 40 residents showed up, which was apparently a record turnout. Susan was notably absent. According to the gossip I picked up before the meeting started, she had resigned as HOA president and was facing criminal charges. Tom called the meeting to order and immediately turned the floor over to me. Thank you all for having me, I started, standing at the front of the room. I know the past few months have been contentious, and I want to address some misconceptions. First, I want to be clear. I have no desire to be a bad neighbor, but I also will not be bullied into giving up my legal rights to appease the HOA. A hand went up. It was a middle-aged man I did not recognize. Why will not you just let people hunt the deer? Would not that solve the problem? I have an existing lease agreement with a hunting club that pays me $15,000 annually for exclusive access during hunting season. That is not insignificant income for me, and it is completely legal. Beyond that, even if I did not have the lease, I have no obligation to allow hunting on my property just because the deer are inconveniencing my neighbors. But they are destroying our landscaping, a woman called out. What are we supposed to do? There are several legal options, I said. You can install deer fencing around your gardens. 8-foot fencing is highly effective. You can use deer repellent sprays, though those need to be reapplied regularly. You can plant deer-resistant species. You can get permits to trap and relocate deer from your own properties, though that is expensive and requires Game Commission approval. What you cannot do is try to force me to solve your problem for you. Tom stood up. Isaac is right. I have done some research since this whole thing blew up. We built homes in deer habitat. This is not Isaac's fault, and it is not even really the deer's fault. It is just the reality of living in a rural area. So we are just supposed to accept it? Someone asked. Or you can move, I said bluntly. I know that sounds harsh, but part of buying a home is understanding what you are buying into. This area has always had deer. The Morrison farm that used to be here had deer. My property has deer. The state game lands up the road have deer. If you want suburban living with no wildlife, you should not have bought a house next to 800 acres of forest. There was some grumbling at that, but I also saw several people nodding. A younger woman raised her hand. What if we wanted to work with you instead of against you? Is there any kind of compromise? Like what? I asked, genuinely curious. I do not know. Maybe educational programs, like teaching people how to coexist with deer? Or maybe you could recommend good fencing contractors or something. I considered that. I would be willing to share information. I am not an expert, but I have lived around deer my whole life, and I could ask the Game Commission if they have any educational materials or programs they could offer. Tom nodded enthusiastically. That would be great. We could do a community workshop or something. Make it informative instead of adversarial. The meeting continued for another hour, and by the end, the tone had shifted significantly. People were not happy about the deer situation, but they were starting to accept that there was no magic solution and that I was not the villain Susan had painted me to be. As people were filing out, a woman approached me. She was probably in her 60s, with gray hair and a kind face. Mr. Calloway, I am Margaret Chen. I just wanted to apologize for how you have been treated. I moved here 6 months ago, and I voted for Susan because she seemed competent. I had no idea she would pull something like this. It is not your fault, I said, and call me Isaac. Isaac, then. I actually think the deer are beautiful. I used to watch them from my back porch every morning. It is one of the reasons I bought the house." "You are welcome to keep watching them," I said with a smile. "Just maybe keep your garden protected." She laughed. "I already ordered fencing. Should be installed next week." Over the next few weeks, the situation calmed down considerably. The HOA elected a new president, a retired engineer named David Mills, who had no interest in crusading against wildlife. Tom Hendricks organized the educational workshop I had suggested, and Jeff Morrison from the Game Commission came out to give a presentation on living with deer. About 30 residents attended, and the questions were thoughtful and genuine. Susan Patterson's criminal case moved forward slowly. Her lawyer tried to get the charges dismissed, arguing that she had not personally trespassed and could not be held responsible for the hunter's actions. The district attorney disagreed, and eventually, Susan pleaded guilty to criminal trespass by proxy and was sentenced to a year of probation, a $1,000 fine, and 100 hours of community service. She also had to pay restitution to me for the value of the poached deer and my legal fees. I actually felt a little bad for her when I heard about the sentence. She had clearly let the power of being HOA president go to her head, and she had made some terrible decisions, but a criminal record seemed harsh. Still, she had broken the law, and there had to be consequences. Hunting season arrived in November, and my hunting club had an excellent year. They took 7 bucks and 5 does from my property, all within the legal limits, and the meat was donated to local food banks. The deer population remained healthy, and the ecosystem stayed balanced. As winter set in, I noticed something interesting. Several of my neighbors in Meadowbrook Estates had indeed installed proper deer fencing, and those who had not were starting to learn which plants were deer-resistant and which were basically deer candy. The community was adapting. One evening in early December, I was sitting on my porch watching the sunset when I saw a familiar pickup truck coming up my driveway. It was Tom Hendricks. "Hope I'm not disturbing you," he called out as he got out of the truck. "Not at all. What brings you out here?" "I wanted to talk to you about something. Can I come up?" "Sure." Tom climbed the porch steps and took a seat in the chair I offered. He looked nervous, which was not like him. "What is on your mind?" I asked. "The HOA board has been talking," he started, "and we have got a proposal for you. Hear me out before you say no, okay?" "Okay. We know you have the hunting lease, and we are not asking you to give that up. But we were wondering if there might be a way to create a buffer zone along the property line. Not hunting necessarily, but maybe some strategic landscaping on our side that would be less attractive to deer, and we would pay for it, not you. Keep going. We were thinking we could put in a line of trees and shrubs that deer do not like to eat. Create a natural barrier that might encourage them to stay deeper in your property instead of right up against the property line where they can hop into our yards easily." I thought about it. "That is actually not a bad idea, but you would have to do it on your side of the property line. I am not letting you touch my land." "Understood. We would not ask you to. We have got about 20 feet of common area along most of the border. We could use that." "What kind of plants are you thinking?" "We have got a landscape architect who specializes in native plants. She suggested things like spice bush, eastern red cedar, and American holly. Stuff that is native to Pennsylvania, but that deer tend to avoid. It would not stop them completely, but it might reduce the traffic." "And you are paying for this yourselves?" "The HOA has a reserve fund for capital improvements. We would use that. It would probably cost around $20,000 for the whole border, but if it reduces complaints and makes life easier for everyone, it is worth it." I nodded slowly. "I do not have any objection to that, as long as everything stays on your side of the line." "Absolutely. We would even have a surveyor come out and mark everything clearly so there is no confusion." "Then I'm fine with it. Honestly, Tom, I appreciate you trying to find a solution that does not involve attacking me or trying to steal my property rights." He laughed. "Yeah, well, we learned our lesson on that front. Susan's approach was a disaster. This is better for everyone." We shook hands and Tom left. True to his word, the HOA hired a surveyor the following week, and by spring, they had planted a substantial buffer of deer-resistant vegetation along the entire property line. It was not a perfect solution, and deer still moved between the properties, but the traffic did decrease noticeably, and more importantly, the complaints stopped. Life settled into a peaceful routine after that. I continued managing my property, maintaining the hunting lease, and living the quiet rural life I had always enjoyed. The people of Meadowbrook Estates continued adapting to rural living, some more successfully than others. I did start getting invited to HOA social events, which was unexpected. Summer barbecues, holiday parties, that sort of thing. I went to a few, mostly to be neighborly, and I found that once people actually talked to me instead of just seeing me as an obstacle to their perfect suburban lives, they were generally decent folks. Margaret Chen became something of a regular visitor. She started bringing her grandchildren over to my property a few times a month, and I would take them on nature walks, teaching them about the local wildlife and ecology. It was nice, actually. I'd never had kids of my own, and sharing my knowledge with the next generation felt meaningful. One afternoon in late March, about 18 months after the whole mess with Susan had started, I was fixing a section of fence when I saw a car pull up. I did not recognize it, so I walked over to see who it was. The woman who got out was in her 30s, professionally dressed, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She smiled nervously as I approached. "Mr. Calloway, I am Jessica Romano. I'm a reporter with the Williamsport Sun-Gazette. I was hoping I could talk to you about your situation with the HOA last year." I wiped my hands on my jeans. "That is old news. Why are you interested now?" "Because it is not old news everywhere else. HOAs overstepping their bounds is becoming a major issue across the country, and your case is a perfect example of how property rights can be threatened by overzealous community associations. I have been doing a series on HOA conflicts, and your story came up in my research. I do not know that I want to be in the newspaper. I understand, but I think your perspective is important. You stood up for your rights. You did it legally, and ultimately things worked out. That is not always the case. A lot of people get steamrolled by HOAs because they do not know their rights or cannot afford lawyers." I thought about it. If I do this, I want to be clear that most of my neighbors are good people. The problem was one person who let power go to her head. I do not want this to be an attack on Meadowbrook Estates. That is fair. I can frame it that way. We spent the next hour talking, and I told her the whole story. Jessica took careful notes and asked good questions. She also interviewed Tom Hendricks and several other residents of Meadowbrook Estates, as well as my lawyer Bill Hutchinson and game warden Jeff Morrison. The article came out 2 weeks later, spread across 3 pages with photos of my property and the HOA development. The headline read, "When HOA power goes too far, one Pennsylvania landowner's fight for his rights." It was fair and balanced, just like Jessica had promised. It explained the conflict, the legal issues involved, and how the situation had ultimately been resolved through communication and compromise rather than continued fighting. The article got picked up by several other newspapers and even made it onto a few national news websites. I got calls from people all over the country who were dealing with their own HOA nightmares, asking for advice. I directed most of them to Bill Hutchinson, who I figured could use the business. The attention died down after a few weeks, and life went back to normal. Spring turned to summer, and my property exploded with life. Fawns were born in the thick forest cover, turkey poults followed their mothers through the clearings, and the whole ecosystem hummed along as it had for generations. I was checking one of my trail cameras in July when I heard someone calling my name. I looked up to see David Mills, the current HOA president, walking up the trail. "Hope you do not mind," he said. "Tom told me you were out here." "No problem. What is up?" "I wanted to give you a heads up about something. We've got a new family moving into the development next week, and they have already started asking questions about the deer." "What kind of questions?" "The usual. Why there are so many, what we are doing about it, whether they are dangerous." I explained the situation, told them about the buffer zone and the fencing options, but I got the feeling they were not happy with the answers. "You think they are going to be trouble?" "I do not know, but after what happened with Susan, I wanted you to know. The new resident's name is Bradford, Linda and Richard Bradford. They are from New Jersey, first time living outside a major metro area. I appreciate the warning. Also, and this is just my opinion, but I think Linda Bradford might have some Karen energy, if you know what I mean." I laughed. "Seems like there is always one in every community." Yeah, but I want you to know that the board has your back this time. We are not going through that nightmare again. If the Bradfords have a problem with the deer, they can deal with it on their own property, or they can move. We are not attacking you over wildlife. Thanks, David. That means a lot. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, I got a certified letter from Linda Bradford. It was 3 pages long and outlined her concerns about the deer population, the health hazards they posed, and her disappointment that I was not being a good neighbor by controlling them. She demanded a meeting to discuss reasonable solutions. I called Bill Hutchinson. "Another one?" he said with a sigh when I read him the letter. "Looks like it." "Okay, here's what you do. Do not respond directly. I will send her a letter explaining your legal position and making it clear that you are not going to engage in negotiations about managing wildlife on your private property. If she pushes it further, we will deal with it. But 9 times out of 10, these people back off once they realize you have a lawyer and you are not going to be bullied." Bill's letter must have done the trick because I did not hear anything more from Linda Bradford for several months. But I did start noticing her walking the property line, taking photos and making notes. It made me nervous. In October, right before hunting season, I got a call from Jeff Morrison. "Isaac, got another complaint. 3 guesses who it is from." "Linda Bradford?" "Bingo. She is claiming you are baiting deer to attract them to your property, which she says is illegal." "I am not baiting anything. I have never baited deer in my life." "I know. I told her that baiting is only illegal during hunting season and only on property where hunting is taking place. Even if you were putting out corn or something, which you are not, it would be legal right now since hunting season has not started. But she insisted I come out and investigate." "When do you want to come by?" "How about tomorrow morning?" Jeff showed up at 9 the next day, and we walked the entire property. There was no bait, no feeding stations, nothing that could even remotely be considered attracting deer beyond the natural food sources that had always been there. "Yeah, this is what I expected," Jeff said as we finished the tour. "You have got great natural habitat, lots of mass-producing trees, good water sources. The deer are here because this is quality deer habitat, not because you are doing anything to attract them." "So what happens now?" "I will file my report saying there is no violation. Mrs. Bradford will not be happy, but that is not my problem. She seems to think you are deliberately trying to ruin her life." "I have never even met the woman." "Some people just need someone to blame for their problems," Jeff said with a shrug. I thought that would be the end of it, but Linda Bradford was nothing if not persistent. She started showing up at township meetings, demanding that they do something about me. She filed complaints with the county health department, claiming my property was a breeding ground for ticks and Lyme disease. She even tried to get the EPA involved, claiming that deer overpopulation was causing environmental damage. Every complaint was investigated and dismissed. My property was healthy, well-managed, and in compliance with all applicable laws, but the constant barrage of accusations was wearing on me. It all came to a head on a cold morning in November. Hunting season had opened, and my hunting club was out on the property. I was at home when I heard shouting coming from the eastern section of my land, near the Meadowbrook Estates border. I grabbed my radio and called the hunt leader. "Mike, what's going on out there?" "We have got a trespasser," Mike's voice crackled back. "Some woman just walked onto the property yelling about how we are murderers and the hunting is illegal. She's trying to scare off the deer." "Call the police," I said, already heading for my truck. "I will be there in 5 minutes." When I arrived, I found Mike and 3 other hunters standing in a clearing, facing down Linda Bradford. She was red-faced and screaming, waving her arms at a group of deer that had already fled into the thick brush. "You cannot stop me," she was shouting. "These animals have rights. You are just killing them for sport." "Madam, you are trespassing on private property," Mike said, his voice remarkably calm. "You need to leave now." "I will not leave. Someone has to protect these poor animals." I stepped forward. "Mrs. Bradford, I assume." She whirled on me. "You must be Isaac Calloway. Do you have any idea how much damage you are causing? Do you even care?" "Mrs. Bradford, you are trespassing on my property and interfering with legal hunting activities. That is a crime. The police are on their way, and you will be arrested if you do not leave immediately." "I do not care. Someone has to stand up for what is right." "You are not standing up for anything except your own entitlement," I said, my patience finally snapping. You moved into a rural area next to 800 acres of forest, and you are upset that there is wildlife. You have filed false complaints, harassed me for months, and now you are trespassing and interfering with legal activities. You are not a hero, Mrs. Bradford. You are a nuisance." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish. Before she could respond, 2 state police cruisers came bumping down the logging road. Officer Ramirez got out of the first one, and I was happy to see a familiar face. "Mr. Calloway, we got another call?" "Officer Ramirez, this is Linda Bradford. She is trespassing and interfering with legal hunting." Ramirez turned to Linda. "Madam, is that true? These men are slaughtering innocent animals. I'm trying to stop them. Are they hunting legally?" "That is not the point. Actually, that is exactly the point," Ramirez said. "If they are hunting legally on private property with the landowner's permission, then you are trespassing and interfering with legal activity. That is a crime. But the deer are managed wildlife. Pennsylvania has hunting seasons for a reason, madam. Now, you can either leave voluntarily or I will arrest you for trespassing. Your choice." Linda looked around, seeming to realize for the first time that she was not going to win this fight. "Fine, but this is not over." "Yes, it is," I said firmly. "If you set foot on my property again, I will have you arrested. If you file any more false complaints, I will sue you for harassment, and if you continue to interfere with my legal use of my property, I will get a restraining order. Am I clear?" She glared at me, but said nothing. Officer Ramirez escorted her back to the property line and made sure she left. After she was gone, Mike turned to me. "That was intense. Is she going to be a problem all season?" "Not if I can help it," I said. The next morning, I was back in Bill Hutchinson's office. "I want to file for a restraining order," I told him. "Linda Bradford is out of control, and I do not trust her to stay away." "Do you have documentation of her behavior?" "I have her letters, the police reports from yesterday, and statements from witnesses, plus all the frivolous complaints she has filed over the past few months." Bill nodded. "That should be enough. Let me draft the petition." The restraining order hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Linda Bradford showed up with her husband, Richard, who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Linda represented herself, which turned out to be a mistake. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia Moore, reviewed the evidence and listened to both sides. Linda tried to argue that she was being persecuted for standing up for animal rights and that I was using the legal system to silence her. Judge Moore was not impressed. "Mrs. Bradford, you have the right to your opinions about hunting and wildlife management. What you do not have is the right to trespass on private property, file false complaints, or harass your neighbors. The evidence shows a pattern of behavior that goes well beyond advocacy and into the realm of harassment and stalking. The restraining order is granted. You are to stay at least 500 feet from Mr. Calloway's property at all times, and you are prohibited from contacting him directly or indirectly. Violation of this order will result in immediate arrest and contempt charges. Do you understand?" Linda's face was white. "Yes, Your Honor." As we left the courthouse, Richard Bradford approached me hesitantly. "Mr. Calloway, can I talk to you for a minute?" I stopped and waited. "I just want to apologize for my wife's behavior. She gets very passionate about things, and sometimes she does not know when to stop. This has been very difficult for me, and I want you to know that I do not share her views on this situation." "I appreciate that, Mr. Bradford. We are actually putting the house up for sale. This area is not a good fit for Linda, and honestly, after all this legal trouble, I think a fresh start would be good for both of us." "I'm sorry it came to this," I said, and I meant it. I never wanted to be at war with my neighbors. I know. Linda made this personal when it never should have been. For what it is worth, I think your property is beautiful, and I understand why you want to protect it." They shook hands, and that was the last real conversation I had with Richard Bradford. The house went up for sale in January and sold by March to a young couple with 2 kids who seemed perfectly content to let deer be deer. The rest of that winter and spring were blessedly quiet. The hunting season had been successful, the deer population remained healthy, and my relationships with most of my neighbors in Meadowbrook Estates were actually quite good. In May, the HOA organized a community picnic and invited me as a guest of honor, which felt strange but nice. I brought venison burgers made from meat donated by the hunting club, and they were a huge hit. Margaret Chen brought her grandchildren, and I spent an hour teaching a group of kids how to identify animal tracks in the mud near the creek. As I stood there, watching children play and neighbors chat and laugh, it occurred to me how far things had come. 2 years ago, I'd been seen as the enemy, the stubborn landowner who would not cooperate. Now, I was part of the community, respected for standing my ground, but also for being willing to communicate and educate. Tom Hendricks walked up with a beer in hand. "Pretty nice, huh?" "Yeah," I agreed. "It is." You know, when Susan started that whole mess, I thought we were headed for years of fighting. I'm glad it worked out differently. Me too. Can I ask you something? If you could go back and do it all over again, would you do anything differently? I thought about that. Maybe I would have reached out to the HOA proactively when they first moved in, explained the situation before problems arose. But honestly, I do not know if it would have mattered. Some people are going to see what they want to see, and no amount of communication will change that. True, but most people are reasonable once they have all the information. Susan and Linda were outliers. Let us hope they stay outliers. He laughed and clinked his beer bottle against mine. As summer rolled around again, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. I had learned a lot about property rights, HOA law, wildlife management, and human nature. But more than that, I had learned the importance of standing firm on principles while remaining open to reasonable compromise. My 800 acres remained my sanctuary, my responsibility, and my legacy. The deer continued to roam freely, as they had for generations and would for generations to come. The hunting lease continued to provide income and help manage the wildlife population in a sustainable way. And my relationship with my neighbors, while never perfect, had evolved into something workable and even friendly. On a warm evening in late June, I was sitting on my porch watching the sunset when I saw a doe and 2 fawns step out of the forest edge. They were about 50 yards away, and they had not noticed me yet. The doe was alert, ears swiveling, testing the wind. The fawns were playful, hopping and running in circles around their mother. I sat perfectly still, barely breathing, just watching. This was why I protected this land. This was why I fought the HOAs and the Karens and the people who thought their preferences should override property rights and wildlife conservation. Because moments like this, watching nature exist in its raw, unmanaged beauty, were worth fighting for. The doe eventually caught my scent and stamped her foot in alarm. All 3 deer bounded back into the forest, white tails flashing. I smiled and took a sip of my coffee. My phone rang, breaking the silence. It was David Mills. "Isaac, hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Just watching deer," he chuckled. "Of course. Listen, I wanted to give you a heads up. We have got another new family moving in next month. They asked specifically about the deer situation, and I gave them the full story. Your property, the hunting lease, the buffer zone, everything." And they said they did research before buying and they knew what they were getting into. They actually said they were excited about the wildlife. The husband is apparently a bird watcher. That is refreshing. Yeah, I think we have finally got a good, stable community here. People who understand rural living and do not expect it to be suburbia with trees. That is all I ever wanted, David. Just people who understand reality. Well, you have got it now. Anyway, I will let you get back to your deer watching. Just wanted you to know. After he hung up, I sat there thinking about how much had changed. The battle with Susan Patterson seemed like ancient history now, even though it had only been 2 years. Linda Bradford's harassment campaign was already fading into memory. What remained was a community that had learned to coexist with wildlife and with a neighbor who valued his property rights. Hunting season came around again that fall, and it was the smoothest one yet. No protesters, no trespassers, no drama. Just ethical hunters taking game in season, following all regulations, and continuing the tradition of wildlife management that had sustained deer populations for generations. I kept in touch with Jeff Morrison, the game warden, and he told me that complaints about my property had dropped to 0. The deer population remained stable and healthy. The ecosystem was thriving. Everything was exactly as it should be. One November afternoon, I was in a tree stand on the northern part of my property, not hunting, but just observing, when I saw a truck pull up on the logging road below. I recognized it as Tom Hendricks's vehicle. He got out and looked around, clearly searching for something. I climbed down and walked over. "Looking for me?" He jumped slightly. "Jesus, Isaac, you were like a ninja. Yeah, I was hoping to find you. Got a minute?" "Sure. I wanted to show you something." He pulled out his phone and showed me a website. It was a property listing. "You see this?" I looked at the listing. "It was for a 100-acre parcel about 2 miles from my property." "What about it?" "The HOA is thinking about buying it, creating a community nature preserve, walking trails, bird-watching areas, maybe some educational signage about local wildlife. We would keep it completely natural, no hunting allowed, but we would use it as a way to give residents their own space to enjoy nature without, bothering you." "That is a great idea." "You think so?" "Because I told the board I wanted to run it by you first. After everything that happened, we did not want to do anything involving land or wildlife without at least letting you know." "Tom, you do not need my permission to buy property and create a nature preserve. That is completely separate from my land. But I think it is a fantastic idea. It gives your residents what they want and takes pressure off my property." "Win-win." He grinned. "That is what I hoped you would say. We are going to vote on it at the next board meeting. If it passes, we will be closing on the property by spring." The motion passed, and by April, the HOA had purchased the 100 acres and begun developing it into the Meadowbrook Community Preserve. They put in walking trails, built a small pavilion, and installed educational signs about local flora and fauna. They even brought in a naturalist to give guided walks once a month. The preserve became incredibly popular with residents, and I noticed that foot traffic near my property line decreased significantly. People had their own wild space to explore, and they were not as interested in what was happening on my land. I donated some time to the preserve, helping mark the trails and advising on wildlife-friendly management practices. It felt good to contribute something positive after years of conflict. Margaret Chen told me one day that her grandchildren now spend hours at the preserve every week, learning about nature and developing a real appreciation for wildlife. "You started something important, Isaac," she said. "All that fighting with Susan, as terrible as it was, it made people think about what they really wanted. And what they wanted was not to control your property. They just wanted access to nature. Now they have it." She was right. The conflict had forced the community to articulate what they actually needed versus what they thought they wanted. They did not need to control my deer population. They needed their own space to connect with nature and education about how to coexist with wildlife in their own yards. Years passed, and the story of the great HOA deer war became something of a local legend. New residents would hear about it and seek me out, wanting to hear the story firsthand. I always told it the same way, emphasizing that most people were reasonable, that communication mattered, and that standing up for your rights did not mean you could not be a good neighbor. Susan Patterson moved away, and I heard through the grapevine that she had learned her lesson and was much more subdued in her new community. Linda Bradford and her husband had relocated to a condo in Philadelphia, where presumably the wildlife situation was much more manageable. My hunting lease continued year after year, providing steady income and ensuring proper wildlife management. The deer population on my property remained healthy and robust. The forest thrived. Life was good. On my 60th birthday, the HOA threw me a surprise party at the community center. There were over 100 people there, including Tom Hendricks, David Mills, Margaret Chen, Jeff Morrison, Bill Hutchinson, and dozens of residents from Meadowbrook Estates. They presented me with a plaque that read, "To Isaac Calloway, a good neighbor and steward of the land. Thank you for teaching us to live with nature instead of against it." I was genuinely touched. What had started as a nightmare conflict had evolved into something meaningful and positive. The community had grown, learned, and adapted, and I had learned that while principles were worth fighting for, communication and education could accomplish more than any court battle. As I stood there, looking at all these people who had once viewed me as an obstacle but now saw me as a valued member of their community, I realized that this was the real victory. Not the legal wins, not the restraining orders, not even the protection of my property rights. The real victory was building understanding and mutual respect. That evening, as the party wound down, Tom Hendricks pulled me aside. "You know, Isaac, when this all started with Susan, I thought you were just a stubborn old guy who did not want to compromise. But you taught me something important. You taught me that compromise does not mean giving up your rights. It means finding solutions that respect everyone's legitimate interests." "I appreciate that, Tom. And you were right about everything. The deer were not your problem to solve. We built in their habitat, and we needed to adapt, not the other way around. I'm glad we finally figured that out." "Better late than never," he laughed. "Yeah. So what are you going to do now? You have got your peace and quiet back. Everything is settled. You can just enjoy your property without drama." "That is the plan, though knowing my luck, some new controversy will pop up eventually." "Probably. But we have got your back now. The community does. Whatever comes up, we will face it together." And he was right. Over the following years, there were occasional issues. Disputes about property lines, concerns about hunting safety, questions about forest management. But they were handled through communication, not conflict. The relationship I had built with the HOA and the broader community meant that problems were solved collaboratively rather than through lawyers and courts. My 800 acres remained my refuge and my responsibility. I continued to manage it according to the principles my grandfather and father had taught me. Respect the land, understand the wildlife, think in generations rather than seasons. The hunting lease continued, ensuring both income and proper population management. The deer continued to thrive, as did the turkeys, bears, and countless other species that called my property home. And every evening, I would sit on my porch with a cup of coffee and watch the deer emerge from the forest at dusk. Sometimes alone, sometimes with visitors, but always with a sense of gratitude that I had fought for and preserved this piece of wild Pennsylvania for future generations. The HOA had tried to take control of my property and my rights. They had failed, not because I was stubborn, but because I understood that some things are worth fighting for. Property rights matter, wildlife conservation matters, and standing up for those principles while remaining open to genuine dialogue and compromise was not just my right but my responsibility. In the end, everyone won. The HOA got their community preserve and educated residents who understood rural living. I kept my property rights and my peace. And the deer? The deer just kept being deer, doing what they had done for thousands of years, oblivious to the human drama that had swirled around them. That was exactly how it should be.